Hartle. This talk is on creating the world's first generative sitcom. Apologies for the hyperbole. As far as I know, nobody else has attempted this, so that's why go with the sensationalist title. Subtitle here is leveraging Azure, OpenAI, open source tech, and beyond to create new forms of creative media. As I mentioned before, my name is Skyler Hartle. I am a senior product manager at Microsoft Azure. I am one of the lead product managers for Azure App Service, Azure Functions, Azure Static Web Apps, and Azure Container Apps. I'm not here today, though, as an employee of Microsoft. I'm actually here as the co-founder of an experimental media lab called Mismatch Media. Mismatch Media was formally announced about a month ago, but we, myself and my co-founder, have been working on this kind of project, really crazy, bizarre project, for the past 4 years. If anybody is familiar with the timeline of things like generative media, things like GPT-3 and Stable Diffusion and DALL-E and all these kinds of pieces, they'll know that they did not exist 4 years ago. So the world has evolved substantially since we started this project, which I'll talk a little bit about as we get into it. So I'm also not an expert on machine learning. If anything, I'm an expert on something what you might call like web architecture or maybe software development, those kinds of things in the web. That's obviously my expertise. What I'm really good at is threading and creating complex systems from component pieces. And so a lot of what creating generative media is nowadays, especially complex generative media, is actually taking component pieces and doing things with them. So as I mentioned before, about a month ago, we launched an experimental media lab called Mismatch Media. This was started by myself and my co-founder, Brian. So we set out with the intention to prove that you could actually create an autonomous generative television show with no or minimal human intervention that could run forever. And so that means being online, up in the world, 24 hours a day, 365. The vision for the project was kind of a pseudo art project slash pseudo technology project. My co-founder came from more of the artistic side. I was at Azure. We both saw the kind of implications of generative media and generative AI and the things you could do with it heading into the future. What we realized is that for the first project we wanted to do was create a sitcom, because the sitcom had all the kind of necessary criteria to be able to create generatively, namely that it's formulaic. There's a lot of sitcoms out there. There's a lot of training data. They're also semi or mostly structured, so you can kind of tear down their component pieces and generally kind of approximate what a sitcom might look like from a generative perspective, which led us to create Nothing Forever, which is the show that I'll be talking about today and also be demoing in a bit here. Let me also make sure I can see my time. Okay, good. Cool. So as I mentioned before, Nothing Forever, or the kind of show that we were trying to create, two of the key criteria were that it needed to be generative, meaning that it was created by non-humans for the most part. I'll get into that. It has to be always on. And also one kind of other component we threw into there was that we wanted it to be interactive, meaning that the show could actually morph and change with others' inputs. And I'll go into what others looks like, but generally it means that the show is actually shaped by the community. We think that this is a really interesting component of generative content in general, which is that feasibly, if it's generative and constantly changing and shifting, you can keep on providing it input and morphing it and changing it in real time as well, as opposed to static assets that have to get, let's say, created by an artist or written by an author, something like that has lead time. Generation can feasibly be almost instantaneous by comparison. So just really quick to kind of do a level set here about what is generative media. Let me quickly ask, how many people here have used tools like Stable Diffusion or DALL-E at this point? Okay, cool. How about like ChatGPT or GPT-3? Okay, cool. So pretty good. How about Tacotron? Any Tacotron users? I see. Okay. Tacotron is a model for generating predominantly voices, but in combination with Waveglow. Okay, cool. So I don't need to do too much heavy lifting here then to kind of explain what generative media is. There's a lot of people in here who are familiar with this, but generative media is the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques to automatically generate media content. It's exactly as it sounds. I always forget I have transitions on this slide. There we go. The basic types of generative media, just kind of peanut buttering over it a bit, are generative text, generative images, generative audio. I just do some kind of canonical examples into there. GPT-3 is probably the best game in town for generative text. generative images, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E, Midjourney are the biggest three that you can go and leverage right now, although there are many other models out there. And then generative audio, as I mentioned before, Tacotron 2 and WaveGlow, although there's a really cool project that just got released, and if anybody saw it or went on Hacker News today, called Refusion. Yeah, it's amazing. It's using Stable Diffusion to generate spectrograms that are then converted into audio. It's a super cool novel use of Stable Diffusion and image generation to actually generate audio. Fantastic project. So that is those are the kind of the simple types of generative media, but there's also this kind of notion of complex media, which requires threading between multiple models, and also requires kind of a complex slide with a lot of text on it. The way that at least we kind of think about this when we talk about complex media, as we think about it in terms of like the steps required or the models involved in order to kind of create and thread this media together. For a simple two-step service, you might have text generation and voice generation. That's something like GPT-3 text generation heading over into a voice model or a voice AI. You might have text generation plus image generation. That's GPT-3 plus Stable Diffusion. Tons of these projects flooding into this space right now, right? And then complex three-step text generation, image generation plus audio generation. And then finally, maybe a complex four-step service, which is what we'll get into a little bit with Nothing Forever, although it's more of an approximation than a true four-step generative service. Text generation, image generation, audio generation, and then what we have started to define as kind of narrative generation, which is how do you glue all these things together in a generative fashion to make a show or to make something like a movie or a book or whatever it might be, actually create that context. So I want to just quickly state that on the surface, it seems like some of these problems with complex media can just be solved by, let's say, taking an output from one model and then plugging that as the input to another model, right? And to an extent that does work, but the issue is that these models right now, these generative models, they don't create expected outputs all the time. So the example I have here is you have a text prompt. Generate a sentence about a man who is laughing and commenting on what he's laughing about. You put that into a generative language model like GPT-3, you might get a text response back out, and maybe you can parse that text response out and say that there's a laughing man. You put that into the generative image model, and then you have some piece of dialogue that came out of the initial generative model response, the dialogue being, what a funny joke you made, right? And you tie those two things together, you get complex media. Well, there's two things that are kind of wrong about this. One, that's just one character representation. If you try to think about how you scale this to, let's say, 2, 5, 10 characters, then you start to get into that world of threading that media together, right? And that's where you start to have to figure out how to generatively create narrative or to create a structure around these component pieces. The other bigger one that's challenging to work through right now is that non-deterministic outputs create random outcomes, right? So with the expected outcome before, everything was happy, but that same prompt could feasibly produce this as an outcome. The generative image model gives you a laughing woman, and the text that she responds back out with is, I'm laughing at the thought of children dying, right? Because those are the kinds of outcomes and the kinds of outputs that these generative language models can actually produce just through random chance. There's lots of examples of these online that are equally horrifying. So non-deterministic systems can't be used yet to create deterministic systems. On top of the kind of text prompt-based models, when you start to think about this from a software architecture perspective, like let's say you want to create some sort of a complex web application, you can train a model to an extent right now on normal good JSON. Let's say you want to train it to expect a certain like JSON input. In this case, you have your ID, the character name is Skyler, and then you have a tag that is a field that says is alive true. That's a good thing. Unfortunately, is alive could also be correlated to is dead, and so if when you flip the bit there, you're passing JSON that says that somebody is dead versus alive, and this is the problem with those correlations and that kind of randomness that is inherent with a lot of these generative models right now. So that's the kind of problem space that not the non-deterministic problem space that we wanted to start tackling that nowadays to an extent. But the first thing we wanted to do with Nothing Forever was figure out how do we how do we take what was available at the time with machine learning technologies and thread these things all together into a system that can be used to actually, create a show and actually create multiple shows. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So creating nothing forever. Just as a reminder, so with nothing forever, the key criteria were to have it be generative, always on, and interactive. Going to just take a really quick detour here into why we think that these are the kind of key and important criteria for generative media heading forward. I think that this might not be a surprise to many people here, but new generations growing up with nearly always on media. Younger people are being connected via social mechanisms, whether it's Twitch or TikTok or YouTube or what have it, to these kinds of these ecosystems where the expectation is that there's a constant feed of content, and it's also a very social experience. Just as a data point for this, this represents the number of hours watched on Twitch worldwide. As of 2022, Q3, that's 5.7 billion hours of Twitch watched online. Anybody want to guess what happened in 2019 Q4 to 2020 Q1 that accounted for 3 billion hours of Twitch being watched? That's COVID, yeah. So a lot of Twitch being watched during the COVID days. And interestingly, so they spiked and kind of peaked at 6.5 here, and then they dipped back down, I think, when the mandates kind of lifted up a bit, but they've still grown considerably over the past 2 years. So then the question becomes, how do you compete with free, endless live streaming content, right? And that's one of the places that generative media has so much interesting potential. So obviously there's this high upfront cost for for terrestrial media, in that you have the hidden costs, which is the number of people involved, the lead time involved to ideate and create a show, as well as all the ancillary assets, which could feasibly be done through generative means like writing, voice, art assets, and so on and so forth. And then there's the actual monetary costs, which is that movies, games, what have you, they're boom or bust. Like a bad game can take down an entire game studio that made like $1 billion earlier, like that same decade, right? Kind of an interesting example was Cyberpunk 2077, which when it was produced, there was the worry that it wasn't going to, make the grade. It hasn't since recouped the cost, but still very scary business model to be in. So when we think about that from the lens of generative media, you start to get the sense, well, okay, it's impossible for traditional media to keep up with things like the Twitch platforms of the world, but generative media has that chance to kind of rebalance the scale and bring the power back to the creatives through these kinds of machine learning tools, as well as some other things we'll talk about here in a second. So long story short, that's the kind of space that Mismatch Media is playing in, and that's what you're about to kind of see with the prototype of Nothing Forever that we launched at the beginning of December. Nothing Forever is a new form of media that combines generative media and interactivity. This is somewhere between a game and a television show. It is really weird when you first see it. It is a mix of a technology project and an art project. It is also a parody of Seinfeld and 90s PC point and click games. So that is a good bit of context to have. But before we go into the actual demo, I do want to talk about the underlying technologies, so people can have a understanding of what they're looking at. So let's get this going. So we kind of break the 4 categories of our generative stuff into this quadrant. So generative artwork did not exist. There was no models that existed yet to be able to do this. So we're still thinking about how we integrate that into the project. So that's coming soon. Generative language, we actually use a machine learning model that we built ourselves, that we trained on the corpus of Seinfeld. So we took all the Seinfeld scripts and we created a data set that could be trained on, split apart by characters, and then ran that through a machine learning model using PyTorch and TensorFlow. If you want to know more about that actual technique, I can hook you up with my co-founder who spent the time working through the machine learning side of it. For generative audio, and this is where we start to get kind of generous with the word generative. So generative audio, we use Chuck, a programming language called Chuck, which is a programming language that was designed to generate audio, actually. I'm going to kind of put an asterisk here on a lot of this stuff. So a lot of what we call generative in our world are really, it's algorithms that rely heavily on probabilities. We have a ton of distributions that we use in our system to basically create randomness while still retaining cohesiveness. And that is in large part due to the fact that it is really difficult to enforce context between these models right now, per the reasons I talked about earlier. It's really difficult to create deterministic systems with non-deterministic outputs. And so we needed a way to at least have expected results. Even if we didn't know the exact results, we could at least understand its type, for example, right? Which helps when you're creating a system. We use Azure Cognitive Services Speech API for our character voices. And then for generative direction, which is that piece I was talking about where you kind of thread together and pull together these narratives, those are the algorithms that heavily rely on distributions to non-deterministically cause outcomes. And this is, we wrote all of that in TypeScript. Our actual hosting stack, we use Unity as the client. So you'll see it's a game engine that is actually going to be like displaying the show. Again, the art assets are the only thing that isn't generated. Everything else is random, and from scene to scene, all that content is new. There's no script. There's no known script happening behind the scenes or anything kind of telling which camera to look where and so on and so forth. We use Azure App Service to host our services, as well as a smattering of Azure Functions. For Azure Functions is actually where we host our machine learning model. Azure Cog Services for the speech stuff, and then Azure Storage to store some audio files along the way. Okay. This is just basically some kind of, or we already went over this, but these are the kinds of like the 5 pillars of what we see when we talk about our project: generative direction, language, audio, artwork, and then the game systems, which provide the interactivity, which I'll show you a demo of. Last thing before we actually get into the demo, this is at a high level how Nothing Forever works. So if we start up here at the start here part, Nothing Forever is governed by a set of rules. There's a ton of rules that basically say, hey, this is generally how a script, which is a set of dialogue, dialogue linked to voice assets, linked to individual characters that are all threaded together randomly, more or less. It's the system that basically says, hey, when you go generate a new script, you have to adhere to all of these rules, and these rules and the content that gets generated has to be based on the set of rules, right? The script is passed to the client. The client interprets that script, generates a scene varying anywhere between 0 to infinity minutes, depending on how we scope it. And then ultimately we actually stream that show to Twitch because there has to be a place to go and watch this, but it really just runs on a box in my apartment. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and flip over into the demo. The demo has audio. I'm really curious to see if it's going to come through on the speakers or not. I'm not sure if it will or not, because we were fiddling with the thing. Okay, let's go ahead and flip over and see if we can get some audio coming out of this. Okay. Yeah, see, I don't think there's not going to be, I don't know if you can hear it online. Okay, you can't hear it here, so you're going to have to imagine that there are these voices happening, which is the unfortunate part. But I can still go through the demo and talk about this a little bit. So what you're seeing is this is Nothing Forever being broadcast. It is the other, like I said before, other than the art assets, anything you see including the camera cuts, characters walking around, there is voices. They're all speaking currently. They all have their own lines. They all say their own things. Gosh, this would be much better if we had audio. Oh, you see a different screen in the room? You see the Zoom, you see the Zoom logo? Okay, hold on. I think if I move this back over here, then it's gonna. Okay, that's good. What we're gonna do is we're gonna open. Yeah, it's fine. We're just gonna open two windows so everybody can have the fun of seeing this strange thing. 1 second. Okay. So what was that? This video should have sound right now. Yeah. You can't hear it online.
Click on more. Does it have like a...
Ooh,
Yeah.
hold on.
Yeah.
Wait, it might be. Like you don't know it. What password does it want? We're gonna try one more thing here to get our sound on board. I have any luck here? No, I don't know what it's inferring. We're just gonna have to go with the. Yeah, back there. Yeah, we're gonna probably. Oh, down. Oh yeah, down here. Yeah, down here. Unfortunately, we're just gonna have to. You're not getting audio online, right? Yeah. Okay. So we're just gonna have to do without the. We're gonna make believe the sound in our heads. Okay. Well, in any case, let's continue flowing through here. Oh, popped up over here. Hold on. We'll give it one more go here. Working very slowly. Yeah, I don't know how fast that is. Okay. I do, but I can't. What was that? It'll be coming through my MacBook, unfortunately, so we're not going to get the sound coming through the MacBook. Well, maybe we can try. Okay. Before we do that, okay, fine. In the interest of time, we'll flip over here. All right, 1 second. Let's go open this up. NF demo. Wait for everybody's ears out. Hold on. No, we're just not going to get audio coming through this device through however the setup is right now. So it's okay though, because you can always go watch it on twitch.tv, but I can at least talk to you about how architecturally this functions. So each scene transition that you see here, when it flips to this apartment building exterior, is loading a new scene. It goes and it pulls its characters. The characters, when you see them kind of gesticulating, that's actually cues for them to be speaking. The characters' voices are being generated via like I said before, the cognitive speech API. That's not the most interesting factor, but all the language that they are speaking is coming from a machine learning model that they're kind of like going through. The kind of fun part about this is that there's also an OpenAI integration with this show. If I go back over here, and unfortunately, you're just gonna have to take my word for it, because otherwise you'd actually hear the flip happen in real time and they would start speaking real Seinfeld scripts, more or less, is what you would hear. But the way this works is that this little bar up in the left-hand corner that says make sense is actually a cue to the community about like what to go do. So in chat, if I type make sense, the game is actually watching for people to provide input, and the bar should change. Maybe I change the trigger. Hopefully I change it to something like that. That bar will change. Hold on. That bar should be changing to reflect the demo. Live demos are great. To reflect the seeing behind the scenes right now to reflect what's actually happening here. So the way that this works is that it watches and there's a set of triggers that identify, see, measures, string makes sense now, current progress 2. Okay, so it is actually updating, but it's not being reflected. So unfortunately, so behind the scenes, I can at least show you that. Behind the scenes, if we go back over here, we type make sense, make sense, make sense, oops, make sense. Oh, we got capped on the bandwidth. We got one at least extra one in there. We go back over here. We go ahead and refresh, deployed. If we go back into here, what we should see is, oh, the title text is make sense now. Okay, good. Sorry. This is helpful. Go back over here. Thanks. Ah, yes, we can get gated refresh. Here, measures. Okay, cool. So it is actually, you can see here under current progress, it is incrementing up based on the number of people that are actually chatting. This in effect will actually cause a rule change to happen when the goal is met, the goal of 10 in this case. And I'm going to flip back over to the actual show so people can see it. And it will turn on the OpenAI integration, which will then kick into effect the next time a scene is asked for by the client to the services in the cloud. And so over time, the reason why we went with this is that it allows us to actually create these deterministic outcomes, right? We can take the content and kind of take the language pieces or the art pieces and so on and thread them into this narrative system that has been created that can help assemble all these pieces together, but also shift the pieces over time based on things like community input. If anybody's interested afterwards, I can also show you a demo with actual sound on my laptop. So, okay, so I'm going to stop there. Apologies we couldn't get the audio working, but if, like I said, if anybody's interested, that's in this room right now, I'm happy to showcase this afterwards. Also, you can go to Twitch, Watch Me Forever. That's the name of the channel, Watch Me Forever. So you can always go check it out there as well if you're interested further. With that said, that's all I got, and happy to answer any questions that people might have. Okay, I got the 3. Okay, all right.
I mean, all the content that the actors have generated in Franco. So how do you protect that? How do you ensure that they don't overlap with any of the real life characters or content? There's so much content in Netflix, Amazon, all over the world. How do you ensure that they don't overlap?
Sorry, can you
any content from characters, like from real life?
Oh, how do I make sure that doesn't happen? Well, in this case, so Nothing Forever was built scoped specifically to the Seinfeld universe. And the way that we're getting away with it right now is parody or / satire. None of the characters' names are Seinfeld characters' names. They're all the we actually do a filtering pass where we scrub any potential mention of IP, like intellectually IP protected terms, so that doesn't happen, right? But we are relying on kind of like parody / fair use to get away with this particular project. But that is the pitfall with things like GPT-3 that can pull like straight up copyrighted things out of like thin air. And then it's, yeah, that's a trickier situation. I think there's two other hands. Okay.
So how are you providing the input parameters for the number of characters and what should be the story about? And also, are you providing a user list of, can you provide a user list of other modes and random modes that each they want in the story? Or
I think I heard this, my ears are a little bit plugged, but I heard the first point. I think I heard the second point. The first one is that there's a probability that we establish that of when a character will show up. Well, all we do is provide probabilities. So for instance, with like Jerry, George, and Elaine, I think they each have like like a 0.5 like probability score to show up at a given time. That's passed into a function that then computes the probabilities of which characters are going to appear based on the number that is assigned to them. And we actually can control all those parameters and tune and mess with all those knobs to influence what characters are going to appear in the show when. And then the second question was about, could you repeat that for me?
Yes, can you have, can we have a user interface of the world that we want in the script?
Yeah, I mean, well, wanting in the script is a little bit trickier with GPT-3, with our GPT-3 integration. Yes, because feasibly we could collect those words, that input from the user, and create in like an aggregated list of, let's say there's 1,000 people watching and there was like 2,000 comments, create an aggregated list and make a word cloud or grab the most commonly like said words people want, and then throw them to GPT-3 as a text prompt and get back out a script based on that set, for example. With the way the model works currently, it's a trained model, so we're just doing inferencing on the model in the cloud.
I have a question online. So you want to look at the chat?
Yes. Let's see. Are the furniture and environments provided? I'll repeat the question. Are the furniture and environments provided as a scaffold? Or are they continuously being generated as characters move through the environments? That is the piece that we are currently in the works to figure out. Feasibly, they are not. The artwork is all like purchased, it's prefabricated, spend the money just to buy some art assets. But with things like Stable Diffusion, as well as what's it called, Dream Fusion, people have now figured out ways to use Stable Diffusion to generate 2D to 3D models. They're really simple. The harder part is that models require like rigging and a lot of other things around them to actually make them seem like realized, and that part is not fully figured out yet by the community.
All right, so with the last questions. Okay, I think the go with the.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is a very interesting. Could you see the potential application of this large being used in the photography industry? I think it's there's no camera, no actors, and it's generated always and interactive. I could see the great business value here.
Absolutely. I think I think that's definitely a great industry that could be it could be used that way. I think also children's content is one that we get a lot, which is like children's content doesn't have to make a lot of sense necessarily. And if you haven't always, running stream of this that, parents can pay $2 for and they get an unlimited content, that's a pretty good deal for parents who are constantly trying to, figure out something to keep their kid entertained with.
What is the first